On June 17th at 2 in the morning, our original exclosure design was put to the test. Unfortunately, it was no match for this black-crowned night heron. From a research standpoint, this footage is a wealth of information. Watch how the tern doesn't desert its nest until the heron is about 10 feet away. This kind of information can help researchers understand things like individual nest tenacity, colony tenacity, and the frequency, intensity, and recentness of previous predation on the island. Had this heron been dining here in the past, maybe this bird would have deserted much earlier. The heron has little trouble finding and exploiting a sagging section of fencing, indicating that 1.5 feet fences are too short to limit heron predation, especially if the fence isn't strung tightly. As you watch this, keep in mind that the heron has its own young to feed, and events like this are normal occurrences among colonial nesting species. Nevertheless, common terns are endangered in Vermont mainly because of humans, and the population is now too small to withstand heavy predation year after year. Events like this are part of nature, but predation causes more damage in these situations where the population is already diminished for anthropogenic reasons. In order to fully recover, the terns will require our protection. Footage like this raises lots of questions about conservation ethics. Suppose that an effective exclosure system can't be developed. Would it be justified to shoot this heron? In another common tern island in Maine, biologists determined that their colony was being decimated by a single night heron. The biologists killed the heron and tern productivity then increased significantly. To complicate the issue even more, both of these species are under state protection. Common terns are listed as endangered, but black-crowned night herons are uncommon and listed as a species of special concern. This begs the question, is one species more worth conserving than another? Young chicks like this are particularly vulnerable on our islands. The chicks remain in the nest cup when they hatch and aren't mobile enough to move onto the chick shelters for a couple days. But they do make a lot of noise, and the heron may have located these chicks by listening for their begging calls. When chicks or eggs cannot be accounted for, and predation is suspected, it is hard to know how many predators were present and how many nights they were there for. The footage shows us that herons can take at least 5 chicks in a single night. This demonstrates the impact of one predator and one predation event, and gives researchers a baseline for analyzing future predation. Notice that terns are not showing any aggression towards the heron. Terns have a generally aggressive attitude and will often attack predators that are hundreds of yards away from the colony. Project biologists have seen terns dive-bombing black-crowned night herons on the island during dusk watches in previous years, but they are not doing so in the middle of the night. This suggests that terns do not engage predators that can't be clearly seen, and may even be a clue to understanding motives for nocturnal desertion. When the heron leaves, it flies through a 3 to 5 foot gap in the overhead grid, suggesting that predators of this size can probably access the exclosure vertically, and the gaps in the overhead wires should be tightened up. After the heron predation, project staff began installing 3-foot-tall exclosures and tightened up the overhead wires so there was only a 2 to 3 foot gap. It took the terns a bit of getting used to, but after a few hours, the terns were able to come and go through the narrow gaps without any problems. One pair appeared to learn that it was easier to land outside the exclosure and walk under the fence rather than navigate the wires. After a day of flying through the wires, the pair accessed the nest almost exclusively from the side, carrying fish from under the fence to give to the chicks. Researchers soon learned here and on Grandma's Island that chicks escape the exclosure if gaps are left under the fence. The following evening, the exclosure was empty, and it was assumed that the parents lured chicks out from the exclosure and continued feeding them elsewhere. The next exclosures were built without a gap under the fence. The terns continued to access their nest vertically, but the new design presented a new set of problems. Along the edge, where terns are accustomed to flying off the island horizontally, the birds with nests right next to the fence were colliding with it when trying to flee the island. The 1.5-foot exclosures did not present this problem, probably because the fencing was low enough for the terns to fly right over. These terns were apparently accustomed to landing on the edge and walking to the nests. But without a gap under the fence, these predator exclosures were keeping the terns out too. After about 10 minutes, this bird deserts, leaving 2 chicks exposed to rain later that night. It is important for parents to brood chicks during the first few days of life because newly hatched chicks cannot maintain their own body temperature, known as thermoregulation, and are not very mobile until they are 2 to 3 days old. These chicks survive the night, but this was obviously not an ideal situation. By the 3rd night, the adults access their nests through the overhead wires. Next year, project staff will use the information gained from these videos to construct an exclosure system that better conforms to predator behavior and meets the needs of Vermont's common terns. Exclosures will be 3 feet tall except for around edges where terns fly horizontally off the island. Bottom gaps will be left where the fences are close enough to interfere with the adults accessing their nests from the side. The tightened overhead wires may or may not limit predation, but they didn't seem to affect the terns and will be used again. The video surveillance system produced lots of additional, unexpected data that may be useful for other research or conservation projects. This video shows interspecific interaction between common terns and spotted sandpipers. Terns commonly share nesting areas with other species, and in this case, a tern is nesting about 2 feet away from a spotted sandpiper nest under the chick shelter on the right. For the most part, the interaction is neutralistic. Neither species negatively impacts the other. In one instance, however, the sandpiper takes a peck at the tern when his tail gets a little bit too close to the nest. Spotted sandpipers nest on our islands almost every year. It's nice to observe these two species interacting, and this shows us that the sandpipers aren't interfering with the tern nesting. This footage shows older chicks near fledging age roosting in chick shelters overnight. Chicks are often found under shelters during data collection visits, but it was unknown whether chicks were using shelters at night. Chick shelters are used in many conservation projects for many different species, but their effectiveness is sometimes weighed against the time and resources required to build and place shelters around several hundred nests. This clip is evidence that supports their use in common tern colonies. These shelters are positioned around 2 nests that were predated by the Black-Crowned Night Heron 2 nights prior, and this is presumably the adult of one of those nests. Adults bring back very small fish to feed to young chicks, but judging by the size of this fish, this is probably a renesting courtship display. Terns usually renest with the same partner, laying eggs 5 to 7 days after the nest fails. This tern has already begun the renesting process less than 48 hours after losing its 3 chicks. This information tells us about our terns' fidelity to these islands in years of high predation. Common terns are integral to the Lake Champlain ecosystem, and they are an important part of Vermont's natural heritage. To many boaters, they are a symbol of summer, and to others a symbol of fragility. The birds return year after year, traveling thousands of miles to raise young on an island little bigger than a school gym. Using science and the tools shown here, biologists and caring Vermonters are working to make sure that common terns continue to call Lake Champlain their home.